Welcome to the third and final installment of the Kangyur, Holy Relic, Time Capsule, or Goldmine with Dr. John Canty. We're so pleased that you're able to join us today. Just a brief introduction to the event for those who are joining us for the first time today. 84,000 Translating the Words of the Buddha is a global nonprofit with the mission of translating the Tibetan Buddhist Canon in its entirety within 100 years, starting first with translation into English. All completed translations are published for free online in 84,000's online reading room, which you can access at read.84000.co. My name is Joy, and I will be the moderator for today's talk. I am a PhD candidate in Tibetan Buddhism at Harvard University and an associate editor at 84,000. And Dr. John Canty is the editorial co-director of 84,000, an expert translator of Buddhist texts, and just an exceedingly knowledgeable and kind person. And it's always a pleasure to be able to speak with him. Hi, John.
Hi, Joy.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be
Hi.
back.
It's nice to have you back. Let me just quickly recap the material that we've covered in the previous two sessions. So in the first one, you walked us through the history and kind of pathways of Buddhism's arrival to Tibet, as well as a brief overview of the process of scriptural canonization in Tibet. Then in the second session, the last session, you went over the actual contents of the Kangyur. So the sutras, the Vinaya, the tantras that are collected within the Kangyur, and you went over the organization, the structure, what types of texts we find in each of these sections. And finally today, we are going to discuss how the Kangyur was viewed and how it was used. So this is, of course, a very large topic. So let's get right into it. Can you begin by telling us a bit about how the Kangyur was used traditionally, perhaps?
Sure, yes. I mean, I'd like to start by saying, some people have said that we shouldn't be in a hurry. There's
Yes.
plenty of time. I'm afraid, that's true in a way, but there's so much to say that we could say about Kangyur, and so we could go on for weeks talking about it. So inevitably, this is a very, very selective sort of dip into this sort of very vast subject. And we, in this sort of series of three talks, what we've really tried to do is to just touch on sort of some aspects to give you all a kind of very basic idea of what it is that we're talking about. And so it's like a kind of hovering over the landscape, and what I hope is that we can give you some ideas about what sort of things you might be interested in exploring further. And with any luck, the 84,000 project, among other resources, will be one of the things that allow people to, discover further, read further, explore particular things that interest them.
Right. So yes, you're right. So today we're going to take it easier in terms of time. I won't be rushing you, but we, like you said, we could go on forever. So we will still limit it to about 1.5 hours,
Yeah.
but without putting pressure on ourselves to, adhere to like 15-minute blocks or anything like that.
And we will try and devote time. It's tend to have got squeezed each of the sessions we've had so far into the very end, but to leave time for some questions because
Yes.
it's really interesting to hear, what people would like to know more about. Okay, so well, the Kangyur is, as you know by now, it's the collection of teachings that are said to have been given by the Buddha. And so it is really, the Buddhist scriptures as received in Tibet. It's not the only version of the Buddhist scriptures. As we've also heard, there are there's the Pali Canon, there's the Chinese Tripitaka, there's the Tibetan Kangyur. Those three are the sort of main big ones, but there are also collections in Korea, Japan, of course, Mongolia, and various other countries in Asia, which are all very important in their own right. But the Tibetan collection is one of the, it probably is the biggest in terms of sheer volume. It's big, you know. It is these 100 volumes, more than 100 volumes in some versions. And so, you know, compared to the Bible or the Quran or some of the other the scriptures of world religions, it's pretty massive. You know, probably, you know, I don't know in terms of, I don't know what you'd measure it in, phonemes or something, but it's like 100 times at least as big as the Bible or the Quran, probably more than that. So it's a big, massive object, and it's not a book, you know, that you can carry around and have the family Bible or the you know, the hallowed version of the Quran in your house. Not many people have it in their houses. So but it is nevertheless a kind of an object. And the first thing I want to say about how it's been seen and how it's been used is that, the Khyentse is a kind of symbol, just as it is this huge collection of often very beautifully wrapped books. It represents the Buddha's word, and it's considered worthy of incredible respect and devotion, and it's treated as an object of veneration and an object with a kind of ritual power. And it's been used for, for all kinds of purposes that you might not necessarily think of. You know, sometimes it's, it can be. Let me see if I can share a screen here. I got a few images. Here it is. Here are the volumes of the Kangyur being carried around a town or a village. I don't know. I'm not actually sure where this is. I can't remember where I got this picture. But the monks are carrying the volumes of the Kangyur around town. It's sometimes done, for things like making rain or averting a disaster, or just for general auspiciousness and to bring good luck and good circumstances, good crops and those kind of things. Here's a picture of the Kangyur being used in a temple. I believe, I'm not completely sure, but I think that this picture shows the Jkempo of Bhutan at some point, who's directing a ritual where the volumes of the Kangyur are being blessed and worshipped and held up as a kind of symbol of the Buddha's word. So that's, very, very important function without anybody actually reading it. It has this kind of symbolic value. This is again just to show you the sort of how this is a modern version of the Kangyur. It's the latest one that was produced in China, and it's a version of the Dege Kangyur, but with notes that compare it with some of the other versions. We mentioned that very briefly, I think, in the first talk. But just to give you some idea of the kind of volume, even in Western style books, that it represents. And of course, it more often looks something like this in traditional Tibetan settings, with the 100 volumes kind of laid out neatly in shelves in a library or in a temple.
John, the image you showed just before this one of the Western style codices, is that of the Bedorma?
Yes.
It is. Okay. So it's the comparative edition,
right.
based
It's
largely on the
comparative edition. Okay. It was produced about 20 years ago, I think, in China. Very, very useful for us.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether the Buddha's word in the form of the scriptures is used in the same way in other countries. I think that the Pali Canon is sometimes used in this kind of way, in this kind of ritual sense, as an object of veneration by itself.
Mhm.
And I wondered, maybe Joy, more about whether in China, whether there was a sort of distinct form of the Tripitaka that was kind of, something that you could kind of carry around, or something that you could visibly
Right.
see in a temple, and whether it was used in the same way. Is that?
Right. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if a ritual like the one you showed with, monks carrying the physical copies, the volumes of the canon and parading it around. I'm not actually sure if that practice existed in China. However, the idea of the texts themselves as physical objects being really important as, symbolic of the Buddha's presence and the Buddha's teachings was definitely very much present. And when collections were made, they were also a lot of times imperially sponsored and were prestige objects. So only, special places could have an entire set. But I actually had another thought as you were just talking, which is that um, in Professor Gina Kim, who's an art historian here at Harvard, in her book, she talks a lot about the ritual uses of books and the cult of the book and things like that. And she actually mentions um, this Prajnaparamita text in Nepal that is perhaps the oldest text that's still kind of been in ritual usage. And what's so interesting about that text is that it actually bears the marks of people reciting it, but also touching it with pigments and like sort of consecrating the text as if it was a person, as if they were putting like a bindi on someone. And this text bears like hundreds of years of this textual kind of texture, basically, which I think
Yeah.
is amazing. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. No. Well, the books themselves certainly, the of course, with the concept that they contain the teachings of the Buddha, become themselves an object of veneration. And even within the sutras, it's quite often mentioned that if they're written down somewhere and kept in a particular place, then that place, there's a kind of standard phrase for this in the sutras, that place becomes worthy of veneration as if it was a sanctuary, or as if it was something like a stupa, which of course was the original object of veneration for the Buddha's body. And the texts, even a single volume, but particularly the whole collection of the Buddha's words, become a kind of object of veneration for the Buddha's speech, which kind of matches the Buddha's body in a stupa, and of course, is really just as important. And it's very interesting to think about how this started. We have this whole thing about how in the first few centuries, at least after the Buddha's life, that the teachings were oral, and that they were transmitted at
Mhm.
the Sangha would get together and recite them. So that was a kind of a less tangible object of veneration. Obviously, it was something that was very important. The Buddha's words were preserved in that way. But I wonder, because the texts themselves do say that in some cases, when they're written down, that they should be written down, or that when they are written down, the merit that is obtained by doing so is, comparable to some vast kind of simile of merit that the kind of thing that you see in these in the sutras. And so, at some point, the sort of attention shifted to the text being in the form of books. But we're sort of assuming there that there was no writing in the time of the Buddha, and that nobody wrote them down. And I had a very interesting conversation last week with Pema Wangya Rinpoche, who actually called and told me that he'd been reading one of the Vinaya texts, which of course is a very old layer, if you like, of the scriptures, where the Buddha says to Upali, if people are not able to remember the sutras and the Abhidharma and the Vinaya, they should write them down. and was this, do we really think this was put in later when people started writing things down, or is it perhaps possible, that even in the Buddha's time, we know that some form of writing existed then. The first examples of the Brahmi script appear in India and are preserved because they're on the stone pillars that were Ashoka's edicts. So these were 200 years after the Buddha's lifetime, not even maybe. And so it's a little bit hard to imagine that during the Buddha's lifetime there were no writing systems whatsoever. For sure,
Right.
reciting and the sound of the teachings seems to have been extremely important, and it still is in a way. But that whole idea of books, may not have been just something that was sort of invented later and only came much later. But I don't know. I'm not a historian, and I don't know
Right.
enough about those things to be sure. But it's an interesting idea.
Right.
So anyway,
Yeah.
so we have these collections of books, and they've served as a really important representations of the Buddha's speech. And sometimes people almost sort of criticize the traditions for not reading the Kangyur very much and saying, well, they just use it as an object of worship, and I think that that's unfair. I think it was an extremely important object of worship, and of course it wouldn't have that power if nobody ever read it and if nobody had any sort of idea of what was in it.
Right.
But then, that leads us into, in a way, getting down to sort of more of its content and what it was really appreciated for, is the fact that everything depends on being able to be traced back to what the Buddha said. So if you're going to make any statement in the name of the Buddhist tradition, you have to be able to base it on something that the Buddha taught or something that he stated. And of course, this is where having the texts all in one place, where they can be seen, consulted, read, and studied, would be incredibly important. And as we've said in previous talks, all of the commentaries and treatises that were written later are all based on citations, and they're all backed up by as if it was a sort of original database, if you like, for grounding any statement that's made about whatever it is, either the practice or what reality really is, or what Buddhas are, or what all of these kind of topics that come up in the treatises and are treated more systematically. But it all has to be there in the kind of raw material of the canon.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in some ways the Kangyur was perhaps slightly less used in Tibet, slightly less read than in some other Buddhist cultures, partly because Tibet also inherited and absorbed all of the treatises that had been written in India. So in some ways, all of the systematizing work had been done in the treatises that were translated and brought in as the Tengyur. And we're not so much talking about the Tengyur now, we're talking much more about the Kangyur. So there were a few new ideas that were developed in Tibet about the teachings. One could think about the whole idea of mind training, the lojong, which is not really a feature of any particular treatise in that was translated from Indian text. It's a kind of new idea that developed with the Kadampa tradition in sort of, I suppose, 11th, 12th century. I think perhaps the teachings on Buddha nature, which were shared with China, they sort of developed in between Tibet and China and were developed in different ways in the two different cultures. They were also a sort of new reading, if you like, of certain Kangyur texts, certain of the sutras particularly. And then there are things like Chö, the tradition of Chö and offering in a meditation, offering one's body and offering everything about oneself, kind of giving it away. And then, there were sort of more refined debates about philosophy, particularly the whole thing about other emptiness and self-emptiness,
Yes.
Shentong and Rangtong. That was a thing that I don't think there's much trace of in India itself.
Mhm.
So, the scriptures of the Kangyur needed to be the reference point for all of these developing ideas in Tibet, and was very important to have them as the as the grounding for all of those systems. But perhaps even before that, one of the functions of having a Kangyur, which was a sort of officially recognized set of teachings, was to kind of delimit what was canonical, what was authentic scripture, and what wasn't. So anything that hadn't been included in the Kangyur was, it didn't have that sort of seal of approval. It didn't have that kind of cachet.
Mhm.
It's not entirely true. There were texts added to the Kangyur as time went on. So it was never completely closed as a canon. And even in some of the texts that were added to different versions of the Kangyur were added because they were already included in other versions of the Kangyur. So they sort of, they all sort of leveled up, if you like, to include what had been included before by compilers of the canon. But there were some texts as well that were nevertheless added even quite late. I mean, the Dege Kangyur was printed more than once, and it's quite interesting. The first printing, they must have had a deadline, probably because of pressure from the patron. But the first printing of the Kangyur, which was called the Parpu, there's one volume where there was a blank page was left by Situ, the
Dependent,
great,
yeah.
yes, by the great editor of the first editor of the Dege Kangyur, because he knew that there was one text of which the first page in Sanskrit, when it was originally translated, had been missing, and somehow in the 18th century, when he was compiling and printing the Dege Kangyur, somebody had found this first page of the Sanskrit, and Situ Panchen knew that it was being translated, and it hadn't been finished. So he left this blank page waiting for it to be put in, and it's one way that you can date, the different printings. And in the second printing, which was, I think, about 10 years later, it was included in the woodblocks. So it wasn't a completely sealed collection. But it was fairly established early on, and it stayed pretty stable. It wasn't something somebody could just come along and say, hey, this is an authentic teaching. It ought to be in the Kangyur. It was quite a big barrier to be included.
Mm.
And then I think another function is to have it all in that sort of nice, tangible packet. This is the Kangyur, all the volumes match. It's a single thing. It's not a whole bunch of texts in different collections somewhere, that theoretically belong together. It's actually physically there. Was that it could be transmitted, it could be taught, and it could be sort of held in a monastery, for example. And again, you could see the same kind of function happening in later in the, much more recently, of course, in the 19th century, perhaps I should say 18th century, you have Jamgon Kongtrul and Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo. They kind of came up with these incredible collections called the Five Treasuries, where they would gather together all of these texts. They weren't canonical texts. They were, by and large, they were texts that had been composed in Tibet, but they were things that were very important to transmit. Some of them were very rare, and so by gathering them together into one sort of massive collection, people would have a teaching, lasting 3 or 4 months. These kind of things still happen, where a great Lama would give that whole transmission, with the reading transmissions and the empowerments and the whole thing, all in one package. So nothing would get lost, nothing that had been included in one of those collections would ever be left out in future. And so having everything together in one place in the Kagyu, I think, was kind of important from that point of view too. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why, back in the 14th century, when the first Kangyurs began to appear, whether the fact that in the couple of centuries before that, the scholars in Tibet had begun to see that there weren't going to be more teachings coming from India, because that had all finished. That India had been invaded, as it were, and the great monastic universities had been destroyed, and there were really very few teachings still going on in India. There were no great Buddhist traditions, at least overtly, being practiced and studied and so forth. So at that point it began to be kind of obvious that there was a kind of finite canon that even for the Tengyur, of the treatises, that wasn't going to increase anymore. And so this was the point at which one could kind of seal it off and make it into one thing. I don't know, that's just my sort of, that's just a kind of theory, speculation.
Right.
I think another thing we didn't talk about much, but in some ways the Kangyur was also used slightly less positively in some ways to exclude certain texts. And this is a slightly sad part of it. There was this idea that in the later phase of translation, the translators who went to India and found different texts and brought them back to Tibet, they tended not, in terms of the tantras, they tended not to find the same texts as had been found by the earlier generation of translators. And they were starting their own traditions. And a lot of the old tantras, which had been kept quite secret in the early phase and had deliberately not been sort of published or propagated or included in these inventories and so forth, were excluded. And they were left to, of course, they were still maintained. They still existed in the traditions that practiced the old tantras. But it really took until about the 18th century until they became a kind of coherent collection, which is now called the Nyingma Gyübum, the collection of ancient tantras, and became a sort of supplement to the canon, because most of them had been excluded from the original sort of 14th century lists of texts belonging to the Kangyur. So anyway, that's we didn't really mention a lot about that before, and there's a lot to say, but I won't go into it in any more great detail here.
Right. But yeah, I mean, that just brings up I think it's just important to recognize that in the process of canonization, you're always making certain decisions, right? And you're presenting what you choose as the authoritative kind of, choice, like this, but of course that depends a lot on who's doing the editing, who's, deciding and like you said, like, how are we delimiting? Because that's why we have different canons that exist in different languages, and I think that rather than viewing that as a discrepancy or as, oh, why don't these different canons of different languages agree? It's more about, who was involved in that process and what were they trying to accomplish by anthologizing the text together, I think.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. I agree. And I think, now, and again, this is the great value of having these different collections. We can kind of triangulate texts. We can see a Chinese version, we can see the Tibetan version, we can sometimes see versions in other languages. In Pali, we can see similar passages, and we can sort of see, we can sort of trace the history back and see where they came from, how they might have diverged, when that might have been, what are the reasons that some parts might have been dropped, some parts might have been more emphasized, and that's very interesting. And the again, the interesting thing about the Kangyur is there are a few texts where the Tibetan translation differs from one version of the Kangyur to the other, but by and large they're all the same. So except for those few exceptions, the compilers of the canon sort of decided which were the best translations, and then the rest were actually lost in most cases. And we know that, for example, in the time of Tsongkhapa, he was still using what you might call alternative translations, ones that weren't included in the Kangyur. That for the most part, we don't have any trace of them, except the fact that we can find them in the writings of Tsongkhapa and in the writings of some other scholars of his time, and sometimes a little bit later too. But they've since disappeared. And so the Kangyur has sort of positive and negative aspects. It's preserved certain selected texts, and others have been lost. And the difference of the Chinese Tripitaka is that different translations tended to be made over a much longer period, over many centuries, starting from the really from the 1st century AD and going right through till I don't know when it stopped, actually, 12th or 13th or 14th centuries. And these translations were all preserved and not all, but some have been lost, of course. But you can often compare translations from different periods or by different translators of the same text. So it's there are pros and cons to
it's extremely fascinating to be able to see the different translations, and sometimes you can tell they were translated from the same source text, or you can tell that they must have been translated from the same source text, and sometimes they're not, and so you also wonder what types of manuscripts they had floating around. And sometimes a particular Chinese translation will be almost identical to the Tibetan, so that they must have been using the same kind of source text, and sometimes it's pretty divergent, even though the basic structure of the story being told is the same. I find it just fascinating to have all of that.
But to go back to the Kangyur being used as a sort of object of worship and merit, again, that in a way that's usually been hugely to the advantage of us nowadays, because one of the things that was considered incredibly meritorious somebody could do in their lifetime, and it was of course only within the scope of very wealthy patrons, kings basically, or great sort of local chiefs, was to sponsor a new edition of the Kangyur. And so they might see this as enhancing their own merit, probably very positive reasons, but also, a little bit of probably a little bit of pride involved. I don't want to judge, but they might have, wanted to enhance their own reputations but to do so, there's not. You don't want to just take the wood blocks from somewhere else and use them. The most prestigious form of that was to actually engage scholars and editors and compilers and make a new edition which was better than anything that had been done before, which of course was not something that could be done by decree. It needed a huge amount of knowledge and scholarship. And so the different compilers over the ages of the different Kangyurs were usually extremely learned and went to huge trouble to find the best versions of the texts and to make absolutely sure that they were correct, and to get really good calligraphers and to the people who carved the wood blocks, and to try to improve on the printing techniques, and all of those things, and make a sort of really beautiful set of kangyurs. So we have all of these sort of historical series of kangyurs that we can compare, and it gives us really a lot of, if for any one text, we have up to 20, 30 or more different versions that we can now consult and compare. And there are these wonderful websites, particularly BDRC and the site at Vienna University. Some of them, they've got great tools where you can actually read two different versions of the kangyur side by side, and the pages kind of turn more or less at the same time, so you can really compare the readings. And we have this comparative edition that we showed you a picture of a few minutes ago. So this has turned out very well for scholars in the modern age, that you can we have all of this resource, which is all the kangyur but different versions. And of course, it was considered very sacred and important work to work on these texts and to kind of renew them and keep them all going, keep them fresh.
Right. I mean, in a way, I would venture to say that it is because the technology of writing was applied to the words of the Buddha that Buddhism actually spread as far as it did. I think that, it's not because, the oral tradition was inaccurate, because actually I think we have a lot of evidence now that, just because something was transmitted orally for a long period of time does not mean that it was, necessarily less accurate than a written version. In fact, by writing things down, you often introduce errors. However, there is something about being able to transcribe something into a physical object that can be carried around. Especially when the corpus is so vast, you're to expect someone to memorize all of the Buddha Vachana and then carry it to China or Tibet, for example, is a lot less plausible than to be able to, like Xuanzang, bring back like a whole pile of text and then slowly translate it with a team of people. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, it wasn't just being, what we see now is the texts, the actual scriptures. But of course, along with the scriptures, there was a whole living tradition going on in all of these places and at all of these times, and being maintained. And the kangyur was, if you like, the sort of tethering point, which served as the basis and the foundation. But and of course the Kangyur as well, and all of the other texts that were accumulating, that were being written by great Tibetan masters or great Chinese masters, commenting and expanding on all of these texts. And of course, but it nevertheless, it all goes back to this amazing record of what the Buddha taught, in its kind of raw material form, of the talks that he would actually sit down and teach in a particular time, in a particular place, all of which were recorded to particular people for particular reasons, and these have been analyzed. And of course, there's a whole study of that grew up about how do you tell whether the Buddha was just helping somebody along by saying something that might not be the full truth, just sort of encouragement or just to get them going. And how do you tell what did he feel was absolutely, the nitty-gritty last word on what could you say, the meaning of life, or the spiritual path, or how things really are, And so this, of course, is very fertile ground for the scholars and lamas and teachers to explore and to kind of try and tease out what he really meant. But the basis is always there, to go back to and to to examine, and including the circumstances. So, but in some ways, it is in a way a pity that the tradition of actually reading the sutras in Tibet was not a very widespread one. Of course, it happened, and people read. Sometimes, particular texts would be read. It was very difficult to sponsor the reading of the whole Kangyur, although that did happen, of course, too. But sometimes people would, sponsor the reading for a particular purpose, the reading of the Kangyur in a symbolic way. And sometimes what would happen is people would read a few pages from the first few pages and the last few pages from each volume. It was less time consuming than reading the whole thing and was kind of symbolically equivalent. Or a particular text would be chosen, and often it was the Prajnaparamita Sutras. They were the sort of sometimes considered the most profound part, and they would be read. Or it might be a particular Tantra that would be read. It would depend a little bit on the context, but it would always be sort of as representing the whole of the Buddha Vachana. But some texts were regularly read and used. And just as sort of exercise, while I was thinking about what to say in this talk, I actually made a list, which I won't bother to show you because it's kind of geeky and detailed. But I made a list of some of the texts that I knew about, and of course there may be many that I don't know what happens in all the different traditions, and certainly over sort of long historical period. But I could count, I suppose, maybe about 30 texts from the Kangyur that were really Kangyur texts that are, to my knowledge, regularly read and used. And that's not a lot, in a way, out of sort of 900 odd texts. So we have, of course, the Vinaya texts, really important. And I talked about the very first text in the Vinaya Vastu, and the first 4 chapters of that are sort of something that the monks would recite at any sojong, twice monthly period. And so that's very important. It's not necessarily something that most of us would see. And then from the Prajnaparamita, of course, everybody knows about the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra, the Vajracchedika. They're very short and so easy to read, and they're very often used and read in different monasteries and in different Dharma centers these days, and people read them, they're very well known. The longer Prajnaparamita Sutras are much more difficult, but they are studied. People actually study them as sutras in different colleges where they do these Parchin studies, and so that's quite a well-used part of the Kangyur in some ways. And then in the Avatamsaka, everybody reads the right at the very end of the Avatamsaka is this prayer of good action, the Sangcho Mönam. That's every Tibetan Buddhist tradition uses, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful prayer, and the sort of part of the Avatamsaka, it comes from the Gandhavyuha, is probably better known than most of the rest. And then there's a few other texts in the Gandhavyuha, the Dashabhumika, the sutra on the 10 levels is very well known, for these 10 levels of the Bodhisattva path and so forth. Then what do we have in the Ratnakutta? There's in one of the texts, which is actually called the Questions of Upali on the Vinaya, ascertaining the Vinaya. There's something called the 3 heaps, or the Pongposum, which is a kind of confession of you visualize the 35 Buddhas, and you kind of venerate them, and then you confess all the negative actions and dedicate, and that's something that is part of, again, of a lot of ceremonies and confessions, and done on an individual practice basis. And then from the main sutra section, there are not so many sutras that are widely studied and used. I guess the Lotus Sutra is something that became very, very important in China particularly. It's not that much used in the Tibetan tradition, but it is very important. There are some others. There's a Samadhi Raja Sutra, quite a lot studied. What else is there? There are really not so many sutras that are widely recited and used. And then from the Tantra section, most of the main tantras are practiced more from the commentaries and from derivative texts and sadhanas and things that were, the Tantra is very important, but and then I suppose perhaps the Hivajra Tantra is one of the most widely used actual texts, that's still read a lot in itself and not just as the commentaries. That's from the unexcelled Yoga Tantras. Then from the Yoga Tantras, there's a Tantra that I think it's commonly called the Jongju, or the Sarvadurgati Parishodhana, which is a text much used a lot for funerals and for not always the whole text, but parts of it are used for ceremonies when somebody's passed away. And then in the Kriya Tantra, the Action Tantra, there's lots of texts that are widely used, but usually for some, as a ritual to avert some kind of obstacles, or for things like, when you're building a stupa. There are two dharanis that are widely used. There's all kinds of texts like the prayers to Tara, or the prayers to Parnashavari, and the Doje Namjom, Vajravidarana, and many of these other Kriya Tantra short Kriya Tantra texts are still quite widely used. So, I could sort of put up the whole list, but I won't do that now. We could perhaps try and publish it with the video of the talk. To what extent it's interesting, I don't know. But just to say that, a lot of the Kangyur is, although it's there, it's really not very widely used. And if we come to think, how could, now that we are sort of mining the Kangyur by translating it, will it be used in a different way? Obviously the Tibet was a very particular kind of culture. It was a very particular country with its own sort of geographical limits. It had very little exposure to the outside world for an awfully long time. And suddenly, in the last 50, 60 years, the scriptures that were preserved in Tibetan have been exposed to a much wider world. So what might we expect? What will they be used for? Will they be used in a different way? I really hope, of course, that and pray that the Tibetan traditions of practice from the living lineage, that depend on the treatises and the commentaries and the traditions of practice that have been built up will continue to be used, because that living tradition aspect is really, really important. But one could also imagine that there'll be a slow adaptation of those traditions to fit with new circumstances. And one of the things I think it would be really nice to see, and in a way we're seeing already, is that people actually spend more time reading the sutras themselves, And there are some good reasons for that. I think there are some really good grounds. One of them, first of all, is that these Kangyur texts are what are shared with other Buddhist traditions. So we now have a sort of this incredible link that has been in a way missing. Of course, there were communications going on particularly between China and Tibet, rather less so between the Theravada countries and Tibet and China. But in other parts of South Asia, quite a lot of cross-fertilization. And the sutras particularly, and the Vinaya texts, are the kind of shared, property, if you like. They're what we've all inherited from the Buddha's time across all of these different cultures. And now sort of becoming available to a much wider world who can, and we can, especially looking at the text in translation, we can compare them and sort of fully benefit from the different versions. So I think that that's a really interesting perspective that we now have that didn't exist before. And then more narrowly, within the Tibetan tradition, the Kangyur texts are the common property of all the various schools that have developed in Tibet, which there's the different lineages and traditions and the four main schools and the 8 great chariots and all of those things. Of course, we all wish that there was no kind of sectarian rivalry or suspicion or distrust, but there is, and it's been quite a powerful thing, and sometimes, when Tibetan Buddhists, Western Tibetan Buddhists, are sort of contemplating other Western Tibetan Buddhists, but who belong to a different, who've been trained in a different tradition, it's almost like, another religion, or seen as totally separate, and I think that's a great shame. And getting back down to reading the sutras and the Kangyur is a really good way of seeing, okay, well, this is really what we all have in common, and there's no division, there's no sort of individual identification with particular traditions that can be a source of sort of sectarianism and differentiation. So I think that that's really good.
I think that's such an important point, because it's, while we can sort of sometimes disagree on interpretations of particular texts and things like that, I mean, what all of these collections show, and what I think all of the effort that clearly went into all of these different versions of the canon across languages, what that shows is, I mean, how much people cared about really getting down what the Buddha said, right? That's really the core of it. And that's what everyone is concerned with. And
Yes,
I think you're right that, with
back
the
to basics.
availability now. Yeah, exactly. Back to basics. And I think you're right that the access we have to all these different versions today is unprecedented. I think, just with globalization, I think, this is one of the perks perhaps of what's happening to our world, that we actually have access to these different versions, and people are kind of communicating with each other across traditions.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really very important. So, I would sort of say to everybody, and I hope that we're helping to make this possible, please read the sutras, and please encourage other people to read them, and find out for yourself what's there. It's fascinating. I honestly think that, the sutras, all of us in working in 84,000 are continually amazed by what we find, the profundity and the range of different teachings. And I really think that in some ways, all of the sort of most profound traditions that developed from the Buddha's teaching, the great things like, Madhyamika, and even the great sort of non-dual traditions and Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and of course, just the very existence of the Mahayana itself. But all of these things are simply explorations of the implications of the most basic teachings that the Buddha gave. And he himself explored many of those implications and pointed them out. And the extraordinary statements in some of the sutras that kind of explain, how the two truths, how the sort of relative truth of there being a path and there being a need for a path, and the ultimate truth of actually there being no path, and that it doesn't really have any concrete existence. How you put all of those ideas together, and it's wonderful and amazing what you can find just in reading sutras. There's this huge variety of them. So what I wanted to do for the last very short time, because we want to leave time for questions again, is to just dip in a little bit and show you a few things. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, the big thing that we all know about Buddhism these days is, meditation. And it's true that, everybody who comes across Buddhism, one of the striking things is, well, it's not a question of whether you belong to it or not. It's not a question of whether you believe it or not. It's a question of there being something to do. And so, you don't necessarily even have to be a Buddhist. It's one of the things that Buddhism can offer to anybody, the sort of idea of meditation, exploring the mind, what it's about. I think there are limits to what you can do without having some of the other notions of Buddhist thought and the whole idea of the goal and what you're actually trying to achieve. The whole thing is about attaining awakening, and it's not about just being a nice person or finding your own peace and so forth. It's really deeper than that. But anyway, just to start with that, we have this whole idea of mindfulness. And one of the very basic ways of talking about mindfulness is something called the four applications of mindfulness. And I want to show you a few texts just to give a sort of a kind of glimpse. If I can find the right, here we are, yes. So here, this is in a sutra called, let me show you the top here, it's called The Teaching on the Aids to Enlightenment, the Bodhipaksha Nirdesha. And it's we use these numbers, these catalog numbers, Toku 178. And to go back to this particular sequence here is in the 125. There's a very basic introduction here to what are the four applications of mindfulness, which is being mindful of the body and thinking about it. What is this thing, the body? And then what is this thing, sensations? What do we feel, and how does it happen? These sensations come and they go, and what can we learn from that? And then the mind, what is it that's aware of those sensations and so forth? And then phenomena, what are the things that we can discover kind of in the world outside, as it were, from these sensations and the mind. So, this is a very simple statement of what those four things are. But at the same time, this is a dialogue between the Buddha and Manjushri. And at the same time as kind of laying out what the four applications of mindfulness are, the Buddha is also a little bit hinting that one should contemplate these things in a way that doesn't fixate on them too much. And then I'm going quickly here because just to sort of give you a taste, and you can look back at these things later. Then the next one here I've got is from another text, which is called the Inquiry of Lokadara. And this is a text which actually puts out in a very systematic and simple way the all kinds of different aspects of the basic teaching of the Mahayana. And it has this chapter called The Four Applications of Mindfulness. And it's very interesting. And it goes into quite a lot of detail about the ways that the body, sensations, the mind, and phenomena were contemplated in this practice. It goes into more detail, if you like. And then, again, I'll leave you to have a look at that. There are lots and lots of texts which bring up this whole subject. And using the reading room, you should be able to find, using the search function, the sutras that mention the 4 applications of mindfulness, and it's very interesting to compare, what they say and the way they say it. And then we have this incredible text, which let me show you the beginning here. It's a vast text, which spans 4 whole volumes of the sutra section of the Kangyur. It's called the Sadamashmir Tupastana, and it's very well known and almost never read. And but it has, at the beginning, it has this actually relatively short section. Sorry, I'm looking in the wrong place here. Looking at the it has this short section on something called the 18 grounds. And I say short because it's, compared to this vast long text, it's a relatively short section, but it goes into extremely interesting detail in what are called the first few grounds of these same things. What is it to contemplate the body and the sensations? And it goes into not just the body, but the elements that make it up. And then it takes things in a slightly different order. It goes first to the mind and then to sensations. And I won't scan through it all here, but there's a lot of it. It goes up to about the, about the first 8 grounds or something like that. And it's again, very interesting detail. And there are commentaries on this part of the text in the Tibetan tradition. I'm not quite sure if there were any Indian commentaries on it, probably. And then the rest of the text is something completely different. It goes on into the way a practitioner, in this case sort of named as a monk, should consider when he is deciding what to do about, how to react to phenomena, the consequences of the decisions he makes. And it goes on to describe in incredible detail the different realms, and particularly the higher realms, the God realms, in the most amazing detail. And it's like, I suppose something like Tolkien, or I don't know what. You could explore these worlds of completely different kind of existence, where people are going through entirely different experiences. It also talks about much less pleasant places, the hells and so forth. And it doesn't cover all of the realms as we usually think of them. It's probably incomplete, but it's massive as it is. And most people sort of would quite easily forget this first section on the contemplations, because it's only a relatively short part. So again, that is something to explore. I'm not going to go into it in great detail here. And I also just wanted to, what is this one? I can't remember what I was going to say on this one. Yes, this is another simply very short version, which in a way sort of the Buddha is introducing the ultimate perspective on the 4 applications of mindfulness. So with regard to the body, they should not examine the body with any concepts involving a body to be observed. With regard to feelings, they should not examine feelings with any concepts involving feelings to be observed, and so on. So this is a kind of deconstruction, if you like, of the whole thing, which is obviously to be kept in mind as one does any of these practices. So it's another perspective that this other sutra, sorry, I didn't show you the beginning of this one. It's called Upholding the Roots of Virtue, Toku 101. And again, very fascinating and interesting, very big sutra. I also wanted to talk about, in this connection, we talk about mindfulness. And the word for mindfulness in Tibetan, drenpa, or in Sanskrit, smriti, is about remembering. it's about sort of retaining in mind what you're doing. And of course, most people think about it, being mindful of what I'm doing, being mindful of my breathing, being mindful of my body, mindful of where I am, mindful of what I'm seeing, something is arising in my senses and disappearing and so forth. So we usually think of meditation as being that kind of enhanced sense of awareness, you know what I mean? And even different states of mind, which are sort of deeper than a normal everyday approach to our lives. But and so there are lots and lots of words in Sanskrit and in Tibetan. There's this whole vocabulary of it, and one of the associated words is samadhi, which for most of us evokes this kind of you see people in adverts, they've got their hands like this on their knees and watching the sunset, kind of they're in some altered state of mind, very peaceful. One might think a little bit narcissistic, perhaps. It's got that sort of association, you know what I mean? And I just wanted to point out very quickly that that's not always, again, this is a surprising thing we find in the sutras. It's not always what samadhi means. I want to draw your attention to this, another wonderful sutra, the King of Samadhi's Sutra, the Samadhi Raja, which is very well known in quotations. And this is one of several sutras that are grouped together called the Samadhi Sutras, where, strangely enough, it's about a particular samadhi, which is called the samadhi of the revealed equality of the nature of all phenomena. And rather than being some kind of state of mind, one discovers reading the sutra that it's actually, if I can find the right place here, comes quite early in the sutra. It's the Buddha defines, teaching this samadhi, he defines it as this huge long list of things. And there are about 300 different things that make up this samadhi. And some of them are states of mind, perhaps. But a lot of them are attitudes or even activities or ways of looking at things or kinds of knowledge. There's a whole range of different, what can I say, things, that make up what he calls the samadhi. And there are parts of the sutra is very complex. It has a lot of different things in it. But some of the later chapters explore 40 different aspects of this samadhi and what it means. So maybe here we're talking about something that holds the mind in a particular direction. Or, I don't know, the people argue about what samadhi means in this case. Does it mean something different from the kind of samadhi we're talking about in meditation? Is it talking about more like a sort of, almost a collection of pieces of behavior? But somehow it has the same sense of being a focus, which keeps us remembering, if you like, which keeps us mindful of what we're trying to do, with not just in a few minutes of meditation, but with our whole lives, perhaps. So it's a very, very interesting exploration to make. We have another sutra in the same group here. This is called the absorption. Absorption is the word we've used, sometimes meditative absorption to translate samadhi. It's very unsatisfactory. And as you'll see in the previous sutra, the King of Samadhis, the translator prefers to keep the expression samadhi because it's so hard to translate in any way that really makes meaningful sense of what it means in that particular text. And it's a little bit the same here. But here we have a very similar list. Here at 153, the Buddha's teaching Bhadrapala, and there's a list here of what this samadhi consists of. And as you can see, or you may not have time and you may not have the big enough screen, but you'll be able to see this perhaps on the video, and we'll give you the link. Again, it's a huge long list. It goes on for many, many paragraphs of all of the things that constitute this different samadhi. It's actually pretty similar. And there are quite large passages here which correspond to the previous one. And there are a lot of elements in common, and the same is true of the other sutras in this group, which we haven't yet published, but some of which are quite well known. And so, this is a new perspective on samadhi that I think it's really helpful to be aware of, just thinking about what we're dealing with here. And then I want to go back to the King of Samadhis and show you something which I think is very important, if I can find it. And this is in the third chapter, which is called Praise of the Buddha's Qualities. And in this whole sutra, the Buddha is teaching this young man called Chandraprabha. And this sutra, the Samadhi Raja, is sometimes called the Chandraprabha Sutra. And in this chapter, the question is, what are the Buddha qualities? What is a Tathagata? And again, I would like to sort of, there isn't time to go into it today, but this would be a huge area for exploration. Anybody who's really interested in reading the profound parts of the sutras is to find the sections which describe what is meant by the word Tathagata. And what is a Tathagata? Tathagata, of course, is a synonym for Buddha. We've sometimes translated as the thus gone one. It's somebody who has, the Sanskrit is confusing. It can mean either come or gone, but somebody who has arrived, if you like, in thusness, in the nature of things. So it's a synonym for Buddhahood, or awakening. And there are some extremely profound, I keep saying this, but that's the word that comes to mind. There are some extremely profound passages on what is meant by a Tathagata, which is quite amazing and not really part of any sort of tradition that I know of that directly focuses on that. There's lots of lists and things of qualities of Buddhahood. But here we have a very interesting passage, because this, from 3.3 here, you might recognize, I believe that this is the source of a very short sutra called the Buddhanushmriti, I should just probably say it in English, Remembering the Buddha. And there are three sutras, very short sutras in the Kangyur. It's divided into three, which are the Buddhanushmriti, the Dhammanushmriti, and the Sanghanushmriti. It's often put together in the Tibetan tradition, at least, as the Kongtrul, remembering the qualities of the three jewels, but it's actually all one thing. And here in the Samadhi Raja Sutra, we find actually the source, I think, of the qualities that are supposed to be remembered in remembering the qualities of the Buddha. And so this is something you might be quite familiar with. Unfortunately, we haven't yet published a translation on 84,000 of the Kongtrul, or the Remembering the Qualities of the Buddha, but it's very easy to find. It's very widespread. There are a lot of translations. There's a very good one by the Nalanda Translation Committee that circulates, but there are many others. And this is where it's from. These two paragraphs, 3.3 and 3.4, kind of describes the Buddha. And it seems to me that, one of the practices, and this is something I think Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche has been concentrating on recently, one of the practices that could be terribly helpful for us these days, and it's quite simple, is to sort of focus on keeping in mind the Buddha. and keeping in mind the three jewels and keeping in mind what they mean, and that has a huge implications that go all the way, into things like, the Pure Land tradition and these whole things about samadhi that we've just been looking at, and the whole idea that, to keep in mind the goal of awakening or Buddhahood as being the sort of goal of the whole path. The Buddha, if you like, has a kind of, you could almost say, a role model or influencer or something like that, that kind of keeps us on track. So I probably better leave it there with this whole
Yeah,
idea. Yeah.
but no, but everything you've said is so interesting because you're bringing attention to the fact that mindfulness has these different layers of meaning. And one of it, I think, is, the way most people today understand it, like, oh, being aware moment. But you're reminding us, aptly enough, that it also comes from smriti. So it is about remembrance and calling to mind as well. And that layer of meaning is not quite the same as, what mindfulness meditation in the 21st century often takes that word to mean. But there's something that has to do with just recalling, whether it's the three jewels, that's very powerful. And it also made me think of the fact that, in Japanese, we have this tradition called nenbutsu, or in Chinese, it's called nianfo, which actually, has become a practice where it's about like chanting the name of the Buddha. However, or the name of Amitabha, whatever the case may be. However, the word nian or nen in Japanese or Chinese is both a word that can be used to mean recite, but it actually is the same word for smriti. It's the same word for remembrance as well. It's also the way the Chinese sutras have translated chenpa of, smriti. So it has that like double layer of meaning.
Yeah, I think again, something I wanted to point out, but we have a lot of sutras that in the Kangyur, that some of which we've published, where that is exactly the focus, that you are supposed to remember, the Buddha's recommending that you remember the names of particular Buddhas. And there are some texts like this which are huge, and there are some that are very, very short. And in a way, it brings together all kinds of things. The Sutra of Long Life is one of those. There's the Sukhavati the Sukhavati Vyuha, the Sutra of remembering, the Buddha field of Amitabha. And in all of these things, the idea of remembering that Buddha's name is incredibly important. And it's a little difficult to understand, except in the, I think coming back to this whole idea of keeping in mind the Buddha or a Buddha. It doesn't even have to be our Buddha Shakyamuni, but a Buddha, which has sort of blessings, which has inspiration, and somehow guides you, over lives and lives to the right place, which is what's really important. And then just again, to take that thought a little bit further, we also have in the Kangyur an awful lot of texts which are called dharanis. And dharani is again another word which invokes memory. It's the idea of holding or retaining something, and that there are particular texts, short texts or phrases even, which help you to retain in mind a particular teaching, a particular Buddha, or a particular practice. And so this whole thing of, memory being so important, remembering and being mindful and keeping in mind, all of those things is kind of key element, and very present in the Kangyur as a whole. So probably I ought to shut up now and let some people ask some questions before we come to an end. And
sure, shall we take some questions? We have a question here from Nikita about whether we know if there are any illuminated versions of the Tibetan Buddhist canon that exist. And if so, what kind of illustrations are included? Have you ever come across a Tibetan Buddhist scripture with a strip of images on the top and the text at the bottom? And I think Nikita is thinking of some Sinitic and Tangut editions that are illustrated. Of, for example, he says the Avalokiteshvara Sutra from Dunhuang or Karakoto.
Yes, well, and it's very much a feature as well of some of the Nepalese Sanskrit texts, that there are beautiful icons of some of the deities that are depicted. I think in the different versions of the Kangyur, that certainly the printed Kangyurs, it was difficult to incorporate images that had, colors or anything like that. I'm sure there are prints in which people have colored in the line drawings, but on a xylograph, on a piece of wood which is used for printing, you can carve, and of course they did do some very fine work, and most kangyurs have some sort of icons, if you like, on the first few pages and sometimes on the last few pages. Kangyurs probably less than many other books, but there are some. But I haven't seen a sort of really extensively illustrated version of the Kangyur as such in Tibetan. Right. And I think that probably was less of a tradition in Tibet than it might have been in some other cultures.
Right. But, I think there were individual manuscripts that were elaborately illuminated and illustrated. But I think, I don't think there's an edition of the entire canon that is an illustrated.
And there are some wonderful, I don't know, not perhaps illustrations, but decorations, and especially the versions of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which have been done in, with literally gold ink. I mean, gold, on sometimes black paper. And there's one famous edition, which I don't think it exists anymore, but is sort of legendary. I mean, I think it was real, but it was actually, when they prepared the ink, they included quite a lot of the king's blood in the ink, and it was printed, and it's called I can't remember exactly what the term is, but it sort of refers to the fact that this version of the of the Prajnaparamita Sutra, one of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, I think the long one, was printed on beautiful parchment using the king's blood, of course, with some other pigments and some other liquid. It wasn't only that.
Right.
And
of course, and of course, we have editions with very beautiful book covers. It's very sort of either carved or painted book covers. That actually this might be a good site.
I don't know if any of you saw it, but for our second talk, we talked about the Yongle Kangyur, which was the first printed version. And after the talk, a friend sent some photos of the book covers from the one copy of the Yongle Kangyur, which was sent to Sera Monastery. And
should I show it? I have it on hand. Shall I?
People can see it. If you look at the YouTube version of the second talk,
that's true.
You'll find those illustrations.
This is what it looks like.
Give you a glimpse. If you want a better look, go to that YouTube version of the second talk and you'll see them. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you. Good question, Nikita.
And then maybe that's a good segue into Joya Roy had a question about Buddhist literature that was discovered in Gilgit and places northwest of present-day India, and whether or not some of those texts may have been incorporated into the Kangyur.
Yes, well, they, I believe that they date to around the time that the texts were being brought from India to Tibet. So whether there was a direct link or not, I don't know. But the Gilgit texts, which were found buried underground in what's sometimes described as a sort of large wooden box, and may have also been some sort of even a structure, sort of underground chamber. They included the earliest known, in fact, the only known copies in Sanskrit of the Mulasavastavad in Vinaya. It's not complete, but there's a lot of it. And it's very, very important nowadays for us to be able to see the Sanskrit it's the same Vinaya tradition that was translated into Tibetan and is in the Kangyur. So it's very, very interesting. And there was also, I believe, a copy of the Lotus Sutra, which is also in the Kangyur, again in Sanskrit. And what seemed to be very interesting is that in the Gilgit texts, we can find copies of the same text in different versions that seem to be, maybe represent somebody writing down texts from the oral tradition for the first time, at least in that particular instance. And so it might have been somebody who came to the place with, some of the texts in memory and was writing them down, and it came out a little bit differently in different parts of the written text. These are only fragments, but it's a very fascinating, gives a very fascinating insight into how the text might have been written down and preserved in writing. So very important. The Gilgit finds and some of the finds that have been made in Central Asia, much further north in Dunhuang and what's the other place? Sorry, it slipped my mind for the minute. But there are some of those Central Asian finds where the conditions for preservation were much better than they were anywhere in India. And those texts are really precious now because they're among the oldest manuscripts that we have from anywhere.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we can take one final question. And this one actually is also related to, this is a kind of more theoretical question that maybe doesn't really have an answer, but perhaps you could speculate on it, John. We have a question from Sasha, who says that, relating to oral transmission, what we were talking about, oral versus textual transmission, could it be the case that the scholarly monks who memorized the scriptures by heart were also the ones that knew the doctrines more, more intimately, and thus a translation that was produced from those forms of transmission, meaning oral transmission, were more accurate and came from a more original commentary. And yet, as readers today of printed texts, we don't have that same privilege of, knowing those who had the kind of oral transmissions. Could you share your thoughts on this issue?
Well, thank you. That's a very interesting question. And I think we have to go back to the paradigm for the transmission, which was that nobody really along the line would feel authorized to add or subtract any material. I can't obviously vouch for it always being the case, but the idea of the transmission is that, this is the Buddha's word, and you don't mess with it. You don't add to it and you don't put in your own thoughts or something. Now, sometimes we can see in certain texts, and this is particularly the case perhaps in the Tantras, where there's been a kind of mixture of commentary and scripture that may not have been, it may have been not somebody thinking, okay, I'm going to put my ideas in here, but it was just the way the text has been preserved, that it was actually supposed to be a commentary on the root text, but that's what we have, So you do find that kind of thing, but it's supposed to be that there's, on the one hand, there's the scripture, which is fixed. And on the other hand, there's the living tradition of commentary, which may well expand on it and convey explanations that were handed down sort of in parallel in the oral tradition. And of course, the other element that's very interesting is that there's still said to be, in the Tibetan tradition, it's very important, the idea that reading the text is one thing and hearing it is another. And hearing it from somebody who's heard it, 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 and going all the way back, to the Buddha or to the early disciples, is considered, the kind of gold standard
Yes.
for any text, and that it makes a difference. That it makes a huge difference, and just to be a little bit personal, I think in a way that sometimes I've found that when I'm studying or trying to translate a text for which I've actually received that oral reading transmission, somehow, I wouldn't like to say how, but somehow it's easier to make sense of, or somehow, you feel that you have something extra. And it's very hard to put your finger on it. Maybe it's just an illusion, but it seems to be real. And I think that that's very important, and very important for translators, of course. How does, a big question is, how does that reading transmission jump from one language to another? We think that when the Kangyur was transmitted from India to Tibet, the panditas who brought the texts and were an important part of the translation process obviously carried that oral tradition. But how did they, they probably gave the oral reading transmission in Sanskrit to the translators, but then how did the reading transmission in Tibetan start up? Was it the translators who did it? That's a big question. But there's something that's carried over, in the living tradition, and of course, on the more sort of tangible level, it's the explanations that go with particular texts, and that's very, very important. And some of the things, the sort of history of texts and how they came about, and all kinds of things which were not necessarily part of the scriptures themselves, but were transmitted along with them, are very important. Some of them were written down later. I'm thinking, for example, of the whole story of Asanga and how he received the teachings from Maitreya. That's not written anywhere, but it must have come to Tibet with that living tradition and was later written down. It was written down first probably in the 13th century, 12th century maybe. There were these really early histories by these two people called Deu, in which we find some of those stories of Asanga's trials and tribulations and teachings and everything. But we don't know where they came from, actually, because they were part of that oral tradition. And that, of course, is still there. There's lots of things that we hear about. I suppose we...
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And I think, oral history, I feel like it's only just starting to get the type of attention it should in scholarly work. And just I just find that whole idea so poignant and compelling. The idea of, knowledge being passed down, and what's being passed down is the words themselves, it's the explanation that go with it, it's the context. If we think of kind of the history of everything that comes packaged in those words, that we now in some small way get to be a part of or get to hear or read, is just amazing.
Well, it's the culture, isn't it? It's the whole sort of complex set of bits and pieces of knowledge and points of view and everything else that you really need to be able to understand what a particular text might be about. And it's not something that is easy to absorb very quickly. It takes time, and so far we are human beings. That's how we operate. We work by meeting each other, being in each other's presence, hearing a voice, hearing somebody talking, being present on a particular occasion. All of those kind of things that we're terribly sadly missing at the moment.
Right.
It's not quite the same on Zoom, but
No.
these are what we're sort of biologically adapted to. Of course, we're very clever these days with texts and writing and transmitting and IT stuff and information communication. But on that human level, that whole missing element that fills in all of the gaps that our brain and body and everything else really needs to be able to absorb something fully. That's really important too, and I think that that's what we're talking about in that whole idea of transmission and the living tradition.
Yes. Thank you so much, John. I think that's probably a good place to end our conversation today. A very nice place to end our series of 3 conversations. So thank you, John, for sharing your knowledge with us. And of course, thank you to all of our participants. Thank you for joining us, some of you for all 3 sessions. Thank you for your interest. And we hope to be able to offer more events like this in the future. So please stay tuned. And thank you, and everyone stay safe and be well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Yes. And thank you, Joy, for being such a great moderator.
Oh no, thank you for
Really
allowing me to
pleasure.
speak to you.
Great.
Thank you. Bye,
Okay.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, John.
Bye.